When my son Charlie was small, about 4 years old, we went one day to a public park in the early afternoon. It was springtime. Other parents like me were sitting on benches watching while their children and my Charlie romped around on a playground. At one point, Charlie ran up to me and pointed to a couple of the moms who were seated together on a bench nearby, and he said loudly, "Look, Dad, those women have dirt on their heads." So I glanced over at them, and they'd obviously heard him say that because they were staring at me disapprovingly as if to say, "My, what a rude boy you have there. Did he take special lessons for that, or did he learn it from you?" I smiled at them and nodded and whispered to Charlie, "You really shouldn't point at people and talk so loud." And just as loudly he said, "But why do they have dirt on their heads?" I said, "It's not dirt, it's ashes." And I immediately realized that was going to bring up a ton of more questions. So I said, "Look, it's just something they do at their church. Today is a special day when they have a priest put ashes on their forehead in the shape of a cross." And again, the moment those words came out of my mouth, I knew that must have sounded extremely weird to Charlie. Sure enough, he furrowed his brow like that was the oddest thing he had ever heard of, and he said, "Do they ever get to wash it off?" I said, "Yes, before they go to bed tonight. I am absolutely sure they're going to wash all of that off." And then he said, "Does every church put dirt on people? Do we do that at our church?" And I thought, now that's a great question. But instead I said, "We'll talk about it later." And we did. So on our walk home, I tried as best I could to explain to a 4-year-old about the season of Lent and Ash Wednesday and why some Christians wear ashes on their foreheads that day as a visible sign that they are taking seriously a 6-week season when they're practicing being penitent. Try explaining penitence to a 4-year-old. I said, "So it's like this. It's like admitting you've done something wrong and you're really, really sorry." And he said, "But what have they done wrong? Did they steal something?" And I said, "I don't know if they did anything wrong. That's none of my business. It's a secret thing between them and God." And Charlie said, "Well, if it's such a secret, why can you see the dirt?" I said, "Well, the ashes, they're symbolic. So it's something you can see that stands for things that you cannot see." And on the questions came until I finally got to that classic parental response used through the ages, "Because that's just the way it is. Now please be quiet." Welcome to the season of Lent. Like Charlie, but not until I was much older, growing up, I did not know what Lent was or what it meant. My family went to church, by golly, but in those days it was not the kind of church where the different seasons of the church year were observed, like in a lot of traditions. We just had Christmas and Easter and then, the rest of the year. I suppose I didn't know that many people who were Catholic, let's say. They would have been the most likely people to wear ashes on their foreheads. Or I was just never around any of them on Ash Wednesday, or I just didn't notice the ashes. It wasn't until I was a young adult that any of the churches I attended began adopting customs like that from other traditions. It was a broad effort to take things that had been done for well over 1,000 years in the history of Christianity and appreciating the value in those customs because they might enhance your spiritual life. Instead of just saying, "Well, that's only something that those Catholics or those Episcopalians do, and let them do their thing." So that whole movement of adopting those ancient customs from other traditions probably started happening at a church like Salem several decades before it ever reached the part of the country where I was growing up. Still, the season of Lent was a completely alien concept for Charlie all those years ago, just like it was for me until I was all grown up. And we can safely assume that season of Lent is an alien concept for a lot of people today, too, because we know but a huge chunk of our population, somewhere between 30 and 40% of people, they really have very little or absolutely no background in organized religion, and that number is only growing. So they might also look at a couple of mothers sitting on a bench at a playground wearing ashes on their foreheads and ask the same questions that Charlie did, like, so what have they done wrong? Or maybe, does every church put dirt on people? I think that even for many folks who did grow up in a tradition where Lent was observed, it's quite often misunderstood. If you go back to the earliest days of Christianity, people would gear up for Easter by doing things like fasting once or twice a week, maybe. Easter also became the traditional day for folks to be baptized. So Lent was an intentional time of preparation for that. And for those people whom the church leaders thought had been behaving in an especially, well, let's just say, rough and rowdy way, those sinful folks had to wear sackcloth sprinkled with ashes as a public sign that they were truly sorry for being so rough and rowdy. Imagine that. After about 900 years, that public kind of shaming was reduced to simply getting ashes marked on your forehead. And things like fasting, that was diminished to the practice of not eating meat on Fridays and such. In the meantime, the idea was for everyone to be penitent, even if you were a good citizen, to be mindful of any sins that you knew you had committed, and just to be on the safe side, the sins that you weren't even aware that you had committed. The belief was, either way, God was keeping track of everything you did. It was recorded in that big ledger book that St. Peter was always studying somewhere upstairs at the pearly gates. So, again, to be on the safe side, you spent 6.5 weeks being genuinely sorry about everything you may or may not have done. And we have to keep in mind the social and the peer pressure aspect of all this too, because back in those olden days, the church was a far more powerful cultural institution than it is today. So Lent also meant keeping tabs on your neighbors to make sure that they were being adequately sorry. Because if you had to spend 6+ weeks feeling awful about yourself on purpose and denying yourself certain pleasures, you were not about to let your neighbor get away with enjoying a steak on Friday night when you were forced to go vegetarian and even give up on cookie dough ice cream. Oh, no. So at different points over time, it became apparent to many people that the real point of following those customs kind of got lost in the shuffle, because in many places, the season of Lent took on the well-deserved reputation as a time when you were just supposed to feel guilty all the time, just about life, just about being human. It was the old idea that we were born bad from the beginning, original sin. And whether we knew it or not, we were in desperate need of salvation. And the only way to ensure salvation was to first feel lousy about yourself and deny yourself and to suffer somehow, just like Christ had suffered and died for you. Of course, that kind of belief about the way God operates and relates to us is still very common, and many people just never question it. It may be what you were taught, and even though I didn't grow up Catholic and I knew nothing about the season of Lent, it was more or less the same kind of theology, the same thinking about religion that I was taught. My understanding was that God was a judgmental being who loved me, but in a severe parental kind of way, and would only accept me if I groveled, and if I wept, and if I felt really awful about being me. Even if being me didn't involve any high crimes or misdemeanors, it could just be about having some bad thoughts now and then, or ever feeling envious, or jealous, or angry, or all the normal hormonal stuff you go through as an adolescent, even dumb mistakes you made. All of that was labeled sin, and it had to be accounted for. or God wanted nothing to do with you. And when you died, as we all inevitably do, you would wind up in the bad place, cast into the outer darkness for eternity, or into the lake of fire. So, something like Lent was a way to avoid that fate. It was a process by which you could cleanse yourself of all of your unholy baggage. But over time, those notions began to be challenged. A ton of people came to a completely different understanding of Lent and a different understanding about our relationship with God. They realized Lent should not be the season to go on a guilt trip, and it's not healthy to waste time worrying about your salvation, because salvation's not some kind of reward. It's not a prize that we qualify for. Instead, Lent became a special season of introspection, a time when you really gave serious thought to who you are and to who you're becoming. And in that becoming, you think not only about your relationship with God, but about who God even is. Is God really some kind of judgmental father figure, always keeping score of our every deed, whether they're good or bad? Now, it's true, Jesus did refer to God as Father. But if we pay careful attention to the vocabulary Jesus uses, it's so intimate and it sounds much more like he's describing a sacred friend and a mentor, a traveling companion, not some kind of scowling judge, and not some kind of a separate remote being way up there somewhere, but a source and a presence of light and love and wisdom and compassion and understanding that never ever leaves us and that knits us all together with one another. What a difference it would make, I think, if we embraced that concept of God, which is described throughout the Bible over and over again, but conveniently overlooked by church leaders who were more interested in controlling people than in allowing us to discover God in a healthy, positive, holistic way. How liberating that would be, and how wonderful and constructive it would be if we saw each other and our neighbors and ourselves as interlocking pieces of a puzzle called life. A puzzle that we work on together, helping each other all of our lives, because that's our life's work. It's our journey to see the big picture of the universal, all-embracing power of love that connects us to each other, to awaken to the truth that the kingdom of God is already within us, as Jesus said, time and time again. So that's how I imagine, and that's how I spend the season of Lent. And I want us to spend every season that way, to deepen our understanding that God does not exist somewhere out there waiting for us to prove that we're good enough or holy enough to be in God's presence and God's embrace, because that's already a fact. That presence and embrace are right here and now as we create a community of loving kindness and service to others. And as we let our good work together be the outward sign that we bear as the symbol of who we are.